It's been a long time, Cracked. Last time I met you, I was dealing with some skinny guy and stupid hats that didn't understand history. But that was back in the dark days when I was still new to YouTube and much less experienced at this game. Now? Well, now I'm still very lacking in experience, but I can't ignore my duty to address dumb and misleading information. The other day, I stumbled across this article, albeit it's pretty old, but still, it's called 5 Ancient Discoveries That Prove Modern Men Are Sexist. Because it's still Women's History Month, let's take a look at what ancient discoveries were made about women and find out if men are really more sexist in the modern age than, well, you would think. I can't wait to be told I'm sexist by people who don't even know me. Are you excited? I'm pretty excited. Let's get started.
The thing that's easy to forget about history is that so much of it is bullshit.
That was incredible. Wow, literally incredible. That was insanely incredible. I didn't even get past the first sentence, and you've already pissed me off. That is a gift. That is a rare gift, my friends. I mean, my goodness, this very first sentence already requires unpacking. It fails on at least 3 different levels, so let's discuss them. Number 1, history's bullshit. No, it's not. There's a famous phrase that goes, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. History matters a lot. That's why we study it in school. That's why we look through it. It's not bullshit. It has relevance. Number 2, the entire function of your article is to use history to prove your case. Don't call your own evidence bullshit. That doesn't help you. And then number 3, you're the same dunderheads who will gladly stand on the graves of people you never knew to proclaim oppression. You dig up skeletons of the past in the hopes of virtue signaling, and, well, that's literally what you're going to do in this article. You who would disrespect the noble pursuit of knowledge through history have no right to call it bullshit, okay? Let's be 100% clear here. This very first sentence sets a very bad precedent. This is a historical article. It is an article meant to teach us something about history and help us reach a new conclusion, and your opening statement is that it's bullshit. Not off to a good start, but hey, let's see if you improve.
It's a result of modern people trying to piece together the past from fragments, all of it skewed by their own point of view. And that screwed up understanding of the past changes how we think about the present.
Thank you, Cracked. I will now return to this opening point at the end of this video to remind you how all of the evidence you provide is simply all from your skewed point of view. Your own screwed up understanding of the past has changed how you see sexism in the present. None of what you're about to present is valid because, by your own admission, history is bullshit and entirely built on fragments of information we have no way of truly and fully understanding without screwing it to our own point of view. Do you even need me to look at these pieces of evidence? You have just debunked your entire article with this first bit. I mean, you're trying to prove I'm sexist, but all you've proven is you don't understand history or the study of it. This is hurting, guys. Let's keep going.
For instance, we assume ancient women probably didn't fight wars or make art because we didn't allow women to do so until embarrassingly recently. But it turns out that archaeology has proven a whole bunch of our assumptions to be wrong, which, in addition to tricking Nazis into melting their own faces off, is exactly what archaeologists are supposed to do. Thanks to them, we know that.
Okay, so we assume ancient women didn't fight wars or make art. Who assumes that? What basis are you getting this from? And which ancient women? I mean, I know you think history's bullshit, but you know there were multiple different cultures at the time, right? There are multiple cultures throughout multiple time periods, and the way women were treated and the way women acted in those cultures varies throughout time and based on culture. From which culture or country are we talking about? That's the most vague straw man I think I've ever seen, but I'll enjoy watching you flail at it to take it down.
5. Women fought as Roman gladiators. Most of what we know about Roman gladiators comes from the movie Gladiator. Male slaves and criminals were forced into the Colosseum to maim each other to death as a means of entertaining the populace and finding use for all of the exotic animals that the Romans collected like Pokemon. There was one woman in Gladiator, but she got to ride on a chariot and shoot arrows at all of the other gladiators, so that hardly counts.
No, most of what you know about gladiators comes from the movie. People who actually care about Roman history know better. In fact, most everyone knows that the movie is insanely historically inaccurate, but continue.
But really, the gladiatorial arena wasn't just a meat grinder for male slaves with rippling abs. In fact, many of the people who participated in history's most notorious blood sport were volunteers, trained soldiers and politicians looking for a little extra street cred. And as it turns out, plenty of them were women. Written records of female gladiators are persistent but sparse, almost as if the Romans didn't think the concept was so bizarre that they needed to specify when the combatants were women. Lady gladiators weren't the result of some patriarchally progressive emperor who believed in gender equality in death sports either. It was quite the opposite. Women's participation was the norm for 200 years, with evidence of various restrictions. No direct female relatives of a general or a senator could be recruited as gladiators, for instance, until Emperor Septimus Severus finally banned it, possibly because he had a cousin or something that got his ass chopped off by Lucretia the Crusher.
Yes, there were female gladiators. Would you like to know the details of a female gladiator fight? Usually the females were to be the opening act. They would be the ones who went out before the men fought. And then they were stripped half naked, having their breasts exposed. They were then given short-range weapons, if any weapons at all, and had to spar in the middle of the arena. It was a glorified cat fight for the titillation of the male audience. It was the equivalent of women's mud wrestling. They weren't the main event. They were just brought in so that males would come to the arena in the first place. Come for the hot babes wrestling in the mud. Stay for real warriors fighting later. You realize just how sexist that sounds? They were a sexualized spectacle. Why did Emperor Severus ban female gladiators? Because it was beginning to be seen as very inappropriate. With the rise of Christianity, many people saw these female catfights in this arena as sexually immoral and offensive to women. So large public backlash forced the emperor to outlaw it. As a matter of fact, I love that you mocked Severus for doing away with it, when quite frankly, he was doing it for the very reasons that you would praise. If you could go back in time and see what these women did in the arena, you would call it horrifyingly sexist and demeaning. The irony is yet to come, however, so please, let's continue.
So why haven't you heard about this before now? Well, this serves as a nice example of how this kind of unintentional exclusion works. When archaeologists dug up the statue of a female gladiator, threateningly brandishing some kind of weapon in a vicious warrior pose, they originally described it as a cleaning tool, because cleaning is a thing that women do. And if you're going to go cleaning something, you might as well do it with the power of Grayskull.
Okay, so this statue, let's pull it up. Look very carefully at that statue. Do you notice anything interesting? She's half naked. This woman is half naked. If that is a female gladiator, that proves that they weren't exactly clothed properly, were they? As for the weapon, people just assuming it's a cleaning tool, okay, I grant you it doesn't look like a cleaning tool, but I don't think it's a weapon either. What would you assume that was? Tell me in the comments, if you looked at this statue for the first time as an archaeologist, what would be your first assumption looking at that? I'm curious.
Then, back in 2000, archaeologists discovered the grave of a decorated gladiator, but were confused when they saw that the body inside was female, as if a woman had accidentally fallen in the grave by mistake. This isn't to suggest that the Romans were any less of an aggressively patriarchal, chest-thumping society of dudes, only that they had a surprisingly equal opportunity attitude about who could be thrown into a pit to get their head bashed in with a mace for the sake of entertainment. But for about 2,000 years, we had a really hard time wrapping our heads around that idea. Likewise...
yes, those equal opportunity guys who willingly allowed their women to get their heads beaten in. Gosh, I can just feel the wokeness oozing off of ancient Rome, knowing that they were progressive enough to say, let's allow men and women to kill each other in open fights. In fact, let's make the women naked while they do it. And they were aggressively patriarchal. Well, that's a new one. I mean, sure, you can have patriarchal societies where men are the ruling gender, but what's aggressively patriarchal? That's an interesting one. Whatever, moving on.
Number 4. Women samurai were more common than you think. In feudal Japan, the samurai were gruff, honor-bound, and invariably male badasses, marching single-mindedly towards poetic deaths. This was a society in which women were often relegated to the caricature of demure, heavily painted geishas whose most important wartime responsibility was crying over their dead fathers, brothers, and husbands. But under no circumstances could they actually join the men in the fight as equals. Female samurai just weren't culturally acceptable at the time, sort of like when people briefly tried to wear their clothes backward in the wake of the heavy crisscross influence of the early 1990s.
Are you going to start all these points with giant straw men? Who thinks this? Who honestly thinks this? This is such an overgeneralization.
But really, women in feudal Japan would fuck shit up. They were raised with the Sambushido code as their male counterparts, death before dishonor, which basically means never be taken alive. Women always had daggers at the ready for the specific purpose of lancing them through either an attacker's chest or their own hearts at a moment's notice. They didn't just fight as the last line of defense in an emergency either. DNA analysis of the victims of one particular battle, the Battle of Senbon Matsubaru in 1580, showed that 35 of the 105 bodies tested were female, so almost one-third of the warriors killed in that fight were packing ovaries. Upper-class women in feudal Japan were actually taught a different form of martial arts than men, specifically trained in the use of a type of spear tip with a curved blade called a naginata. This doesn't mean that women were any less deadly, just that the specific method of murder training received was dealt out along gender lines and according to particular strength, for the same reason that you wouldn't give Johnny Hatchet Slayer a baseball bat. Wives of samurai were expected to know every bit as much about warfare as their husbands, and would sometimes even follow them into battle if the situation demanded it, aka if they didn't feel like staying home to manage the estate while their husbands were out stabbing things. It was actually a law that a military commander's wife would assume command if her husband was absent from duty. By way of analogy, if the President of the United States was kidnapped by ninjas, the line of succession would not go to the Vice President, but to the First Lady. In fact, one of the more popular samurai legends in Japan is that of Tomoe Gozen, a 12th century female samurai known for straight up lopping motherfuckers' heads off. But to this day, say samurai, and whoever is listening is going to automatically picture a dude. That's a real shame. Children could really benefit from learning about a heroic lady role model who dealt out powerful life lessons in the form of a righteous decapitation.
Ooh, how to address this one. Okay, you're taking the idea that women sometimes fought in war, and implying that means they had equal rights to men. You at no point acknowledge that the husband or male samurai had power and authority over his wives and daughters. In fact, you try to imply that's not the case by saying that women could just follow their husbands into battle if they felt like it. No, they could if they were asked or ordered to. A samurai was a servant. They served the daimyo. A female samurai wasn't going anywhere if her husband or lord told her not to. You mentioned Tomoe Gozen. Mind telling everyone what happened to her in the legend? Who was she serving? Because if she's a samurai, she's serving somebody. She served her husband. She served her lord. So she was still doing it at the behest of a man. Here's why. Because even though samurai women could fight, there is evidence to support that they did fight. I grant you that. It was still a patriarchal society. Men were the dominant rulers. There were male emperors, male shoguns, male daimyos. There could be women who stood in for daimyos. They could be female stand-ins, but as a general rule, men ran the country. So it is a patriarchal society. I grant you this. Why don't you bring that up? But here's the big one. This is my favorite part. You say it's a shame children can't learn from heroic lady role models who decapitate people righteously. Mind if we twist that around? How about if a little boy is reading about St. George and the dragon and learns how St. George cut off a dragon's head to save a princess? Would you say that's a good heroic role model? Would you? Or would you call it a patriarchal example of teaching toxic masculinity to young boys through animal cruelty and the false impression that women are just trophies to be won? Yeah, see, it's all well and good when it's a lady in a violent battle, but when it's a man, it's toxic masculinity. And don't get me wrong. In my personal opinion, I'm all for strong lady role models, including Tomoe Gozen. I'm totally fine with that. I think they're great. But I'm asking you, the article writers, Because the funny thing is, I've read some crazy cracked articles. I've read some Cracked, I've read some BuzzFeed, I've read a lot of different articles from a lot of places very similar to this one. You don't talk about the good male role models in violent circumstances. You talk about how it teaches toxic masculinity. Why is this okay? If Tomoe Gozen was Thomas Gozanas and he was a samurai going out killing people, would you call that a role model or patriarchal toxic masculinity? I'm just saying. But moving on.
Number 3. The legendary Amazon warrior women really existed. Amazons, unnaturally huge and bloodthirsty warrior women, are a mythological warrior race dating back to Greek antiquity in the poems of Homer, so it's easy to lump them in with the rest of the great epic poets' fevered imaginings, such as Cyclopses, mermaids, and Armanda Santi. Outside of Wonder Woman in that one episode of Futurama, the legend of the all-female warrior society commonly involves a number of memorable tropes. They were giants, they killed male babies at birth, and they frequently sliced off one boob so that they could better wield a bow and arrow. But by far the most fanciful notion regarding the legendary Amazon warriors is that they existed at all. But really, modern archaeology is slowly coming to terms with the revelation that the Amazons actually did exist, even if they weren't 10 feet tall and they generally had 2 intact breasts. They didn't come from the jungle. The Amazon rainforest and river were named after the Amazons, not the other way around. But what the Greeks were probably referring to were what we now know as the Scythians, warrior tribes from around modern-day Iran and Turkey. The scientific consensus during most of the 20th century was that the Greeks, when talking about warrior women, were actually referring to beardless ladymen that were mockingly referred to as female just to throw some shade. It's not too far-fetched to think that the bearded biceps from 300 would call a bunch of clean-shaven men with fabulous bone structures women in a derogatory fashion. People still do that shit today, but modern excavation of Scythian grave sites in the 1990s has revealed that the warrior ranks included both men and women in equal numbers. Also, the female warriors were emblazoned with just as many tattoos and battle wounds as their male counterparts. They were even buried with their armor and weapons, just like the men, almost as though the Scythian culture didn't think that was weird at all.
Okay, so I'm not a big expert on this, but I'll point out what I know. A couple things. First, seeing as their flesh is all but gone by now, how do you know they had tattoos and battle wounds just like men? Not saying they didn't, just want to know how that was figured out. Also, they were not in equal number. According to Dr. David Anthony, an anthropologist who studied the Scythian findings, he said that about 20% of the Scythian burial mounds dug up contained female warrior remains. So while there were many, they were probably not equal. There were probably more male warriors out there than female. I'm not saying there weren't female, I'm saying probably more male, so that's not exactly accurate. They weren't equal. At least not by any evidence we have.
Also, studies of parenting traditions reveal that these females, battle lords, probably didn't murder their male children at birth. For one, that doesn't make a whole lot of biological sense unless the Amazons were able to reproduce asexually like giant gremlins, which most scholars agree is unlikely. It's now thought that boys were sent back home to be raised by their fathers, or by neighboring tribes as a sign of goodwill, while the warrior women focus on the more important task of beating the shit out of the Greeks.
The Scythians only fought the Greeks on a few occasions and actually waged war all across Eastern Asia and Europe. In fact, on most occasions, the Scythians were well received by Greece and both benefited from each other. In fact, this may shock you, it's believed that the Scythians participated and controlled some of the slave trade in Greece during the 6th century. Oops. They were a nomadic warrior people, where it makes perfect sense that the women might have to fight too at times. If your people are often on the move and often engaged in war, it's obviously a necessity that everyone be able to fight. And why would the women send the boys to be raised by their fathers while the women fight? Well, odds are pretty good that the real course of action was to raise the children in spite of the battling. What would probably happen is the women would give birth, stay at home for a while to raise the children, maybe alternate or work with their husbands or the men to help raise the children, and fight when needed. Perhaps the women traded off with men. We don't know. You realize, though, that they wouldn't fight nonstop, right? I mean, even the Spartans rested. And of course, women are going to want to raise the next generation. It wasn't a complete gender role reversal where men took care of the house and women went off and fight. By your own fabricated logic, they were equal in number. Equal numbers of males and females fought. So even by that logic, it still made sense that men weren't just reversing roles. So, whatever.
Number 2, Vikings brought their wives along. We said earlier that the word samurai conjures up a specifically male image, but that's even more true with Viking, which brings us to mind bearded rapists hopping on their longboats to burn new and exciting lands to the ground. The one thing everyone knows about Viking culture is that the men spent their days splitting people's heads open with axes, while the women stayed at home to become obese, grow pigtails, and sing opera songs. Our knowledge of Viking culture is drawn primarily from Hagar the Horrible.
Okay, I know you're creating a magnificent straw man here, truly, great work. But you're not wrong either. See, Vikings were Norsemen who had the specific job or goal of going out, finding land to pillage, plunder, and rob. And in these acts, this included rape, kidnapping, arson, sabotage, looting, and killing. So, despite you trying to build an overgeneralized statement, you're not wrong. So, let's see what else you have to say.
But really, the idea that exploration and conquest was purely a man's job is almost entirely based on romanticized modern fiction that actual history. In fact, the word Viking itself is a misnomer when referring to the ancient Norse people. According to historian Professor Erika Hagelberg, it's the same thing as referring to all Americans as Marines. Really, the Norse were much more interested in peaceful trade and colonization than they were in beating people up and taking their shit, and women took a much more active role in Nordic society than most contemporary representations of Norse people would have us believe. While it's long been assumed that screaming, bloodthirsty Norsemen went out and conquered Europe alone and repopulated it with sexual violence, modern DNA evidence shows that they commonly brought their entire families along on voyages and established new colonies. If anything, they were more like Scandinavian pilgrims and straight up murdering reapers, although any colonial society depends at least somewhat on murderous reaping.
Now see that there's the problem. Your title was Vikings brought their women along, but now you're not saying Viking, you're saying Norse. You've altered direction here. You're not talking about Vikings going out raiding. You're talking about when the Norse were establishing colonies. So let's actually be intellectually honest for a moment, okay? Did Vikings bring their wives along on Viking raids? No, they did not. Did Norsemen bring their wives along to establish new colonies? Yes, they did. So your entire piece of evidence here was built on top of a fabrication and misdirection by switching terminologies.
To be clear, there isn't much evidence that women played an active role in those more stab-happy aspects of Viking invasions.
Well done. You just shot your own point in the foot and verified what I just said.
But we do know that lady folks held a higher place in society than just waiting patiently back in Iceland and making sure the boar was properly roasted in time for their blood-soaked husband to return and slice off a man-sized portion with English Brainer, the sword that brained 100 Englishmen.
What place was that, pray tell? You haven't said one thing about what Viking women actually did. You mentioned they helped their husbands establish colonies, good, but what did they do? What was their role? Tell me about the Norse women. In fact, let's talk about the non-Norse women that the Vikings interacted with. Want to know how some Vikings got wives? Kidnapping them. Some of that modern DNA evidence they mentioned earlier might be explained by the fact that many Vikings would kidnap women and bring them back as forced wives. The resulting offspring would be of mixed heritage as a result. So in a sense, you are right. Vikings did take their wives along, whether they wanted to or not, and whether they were even their wives at the time or not.
Oops. Number 1. Artists in the Stone Age were mostly women. When the Stone Age rolled around and human beings suddenly became aware that their hands could be used for things other than punching food to death, they started producing copious amounts of artwork. Notably, the artwork include cave paintings and tiny sculptures that were incredible achievements for their time, even if all of them objectively look like shit.
Considering the fact that some modern museums are putting literal shit and functioning toilets on display and passing it off as shocking art, I'm surprised you're not praising the hell out of these early paintings because it looks like shit. I mean, why does it look bad to you? I thought y'all liked shocking and avant-garde.
What you might not know is that when archaeologists started digging up these ancient art projects, they made an interesting discovery. The very earliest human artwork appeared to be pornography, a revelation that probably resulted in archaeologists high-fiving each other and making Tim Allen noises. We're talking about cave paintings of vaginas, giant penises carved out of animal bone, and the famous Venus figurines, small statuettes of women found all over the ancient world that depicted females as headless tree trunks with comically huge breasts. Archaeologists have always assumed that these ancient carvings were made by men because who the hell else would spend their time drawing rudimentary porn and sculpted titty action figures? As for cave paintings, the predominant assumption has always been that they were done by men because, well, pretty much just because.
Pretty much just because. Now, that's an argument I've not heard in a long time. It works really well in most murder trials. Your Honor, my client did not murder these people because... well, pretty much just because. Oh, well, how can we convict on that sound reasoning? I'm not guilty. Nice touch. Do tell me, what archaeologists assume this? Which archaeological field journal had this written down? Sure, maybe someone assumed it was men who drew it, but why did they assume it was for pornographic reasons? No, really, if you're going to make this claim that archaeologists assumed this, I'd like to know where it's written down. If you have the article or the academic journal that says where they made that assumption, I want to see it. Please send it to me. I want to read it. And if you do, I'll see where you got it. But for now, I don't see anything. So where's the assumption coming from?
But really, you know where this is going. Many archaeologists have recently decided that most cave paintings were probably made by women. How the hell can they possibly know this outside of finding ancient signatures scribbled on the backs of charcoal mammoths? Well, on average, female hands have a ring finger that is shorter than the index finger, whereas in men it's the other way around. And this difference is believed to have been more pronounced among ancient people. Applying this rule to the handprints left on cave paintings, scientists have come to the conclusion that nearly 3/4 of them were made by females.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but the picture you provide in this article doesn't look all that conclusive. I mean, that ring finger doesn't look a lot shorter.
The paintings could have been some sort of kind of ritual. Some hunter-gatherer societies had female shamans, or they could have just been the result of too many hours sitting alone in a dusty cave on Saturday afternoon. And when female archaeologists began studying the Venus figurines, they noticed they seemed awfully familiar when viewed from a certain angle. That is, from the top down. The figurines bear a striking resemblance to the way women, particularly pregnant women, would have seen themselves while looking straight down at their bodies. Basically, just a tidal wave of boobs, bellies, and thighs. This female perspective has given rise to the alternate theory that, far from being masturbation aids for beta males, the Venus figurines might actually have been self-portraits, something for the pregnant cave-bound women to occupy their time with, while the menfolk were out on their food battling runs or in order to track the progress of their pregnancy, sort of like an ancient growth chart. Either way, the fact that we stumbled across these figurines, our first assumption was, I bet dudes used to jerk off to these things, says a lot. Though we suppose just because a woman made them doesn't necessarily mean some dude didn't jerk off to them later.
That's an interesting theory proposed. Yeah, it's an interesting theory, but it is just a theory. And as you said at the beginning, history is bullshit since we're only taking fragments of information and using our own skewed point of view to draw unclear conclusions. For all you know, these figurines were just used as early forms of porn, but I guess we'll never know. And I love how you, again, throw out this beautiful straw man that our first assumption was that they were only used for porn, meant to jerk off to, without citing a reference or a source, which, again, I want to see. But here's the best part, guys. The best part. The absolute best. This article was meant to do one thing: prove that men today are sexist based on these revelations. You've proved nothing. Nothing.
You lose. Good day, sir.
You didn't prove anything from this article. That gladiator discovery? Okay, so Romans allowed females to be gladiators. We allow women in the UFC. What's your point? Oh, is it because we didn't know or we assumed women couldn't? Yeah, well, we didn't know that the earth revolved around the sun at one point either. We figured it out over time. That's the nature of studying history. We learn new things. The samurai discovery? Yeah, lots of people assume women didn't fight in samurai culture, but that doesn't make us sexist. It's because the women in the feudal era were under a legitimate patriarchal society where men had power over women. It's a natural assumption to make that women wouldn't do much of the fighting. The Amazon discovery. So there was a culture that let women fight alongside their men. Whatever. It proves nothing about us today. If anything, what it should prove is how progressive they were for the time period, if no other cultures were doing that at the time. You might say, man, this shows how progressive they were compared to the Athenians, but maybe they weren't as progressive as the Spartans because the Spartans did this and this and that, but that would have been an interesting discussion. But no, you're saying we're the sexist ones because we didn't know that this was real. Tell me, did you know that Amazons were real before this? The Viking discovery? I'd hardly call it a discovery since you twisted the terminology to create a false narrative. But even granting you your point, you didn't explain what women did in Norse society and just said it, all they did was travel with their husbands to establish new colonies. For all you know, once they got to these colonies, they were treated as baby makers and laundry maids. But you don't know, and you prove that expertly. The wall paintings and sexual idols bit, it proves nothing. All it shows is that women were making art in the Stone Age, not unlike women who make art into the future and beyond. It doesn't prove that they were progressive back then. It doesn't prove we're more sexist now. As a matter of fact, every single thing you praise these past civilizations for, we now do in our society. Meaning, we're just as equal, if not more equal than they were. We let women serve in our military today. We let women travel around with us wherever we go to new places and let them travel at their own leisure. And women are free to do art when and where they want and profit off of it. Do tell me how any of what you pointed out proves men today are sexist. The only way it proves anything is if you're saying, because we assumed the inverse, because we assumed women were not equal back then, it just proves that we have a sexist idea of women today. If that's your argument, then I call bupkis on it, because what history is all about is learning new things. We make assumptions to begin with based on preconceived understandings and because of limited evidence. As we gain more evidence, we gain new knowledge. That's the nature of history. There was a time period where we did not know that the earth revolved around the sun, and we believed the earth to be flat. We learned more. It doesn't mean that the people of that time were ignorant or stupid. It just means that we learned something new over time. But let's pretend for just a minute that it did prove something, that your article did prove that we were somehow more sexist today. Let's say that you're 100% right and we are more sexist today. Want to know how I'd like to respond to you?
The thing that's easy to forget about history is that so much of it is bullshit. It's a result of modern people trying to piece together the past from fragments, all of it skewed by their own point of view. And that screwed up understanding of the past changes how we think about the present.
Your own opening thesis completely wrecks the credibility of your own position. As an English teacher, I would fail you for this, but as a history teacher, I would laugh you out of the classroom. I wouldn't even bother giving you an F because I would be doing too much dignity to your article. It's not worth the letter. I'd refuse to acknowledge it and tell you to go back and try it again and turn it in at a later date for half credit. Your historical points lack any reference or evidence to support them. You throw out straw men, red herrings, ad hominems, and you apply motive frequently. Your own thesis contradicts the goal of your article, and you didn't even give it a reasonable conclusion.
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Whew. I'm the Raven Knight. This article was terrible, but very entertaining to laugh at. I hope y'all had a few good laughs too. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.